Okay, Jonathan Zimmerman, thank you so much for coming on. And so you've just written a book, which I have here, Free Speech and Why You Should Give a Damn. So that's my first question. Why should we give a damn about free speech?
Well, I think we should give a damn about free speech because free speech has been absolutely integral and critical to every campaign for social justice in the history of the United States. Um, I know you're not in the United States, and I should apologize. It's a very America-centric book, but I think you could find many analogs in other countries, especially in Western Europe. The worst myth of our own time is that free speech is a conservative idea or an idea that prevents change. The reason I wrote the book and the reason we should give a damn is to revive our understanding of free speech as a radical idea, and specifically the idea that has undergirded every radical movement for change: women's rights, Black rights, gay rights, on and on and on. Without free speech, you don't have those things.
Right. Now, is this pure at the moment? Do you think this is purely a democratic problem, or is this also happening on the right? Because I think on the left, we have people maybe trying to censor people's speech when they speak about anything they might find offensive. But then we also find on the right with Trump trying to get rid of news corporations that he would deem fake news. So does it happen both sides?
Oh, definitely. And this is why I'm uncomfortable with the term cancel culture, because generally when somebody uses it, what they're saying is the other side is canceling. And they're not wrong, but the problem is they're not looking in the mirror. Cancel culture is real, but especially in the American context, it's eminently bipartisan. And arguably the Republican form of cancel culture is worse just because it has more teeth. So in the United States right now, there are over 15 states that are considering bills that would prevent schools from teaching the 1619 Project. What is that except cancel culture? And it's brought to you almost exclusively by Republicans.
I'm also seeing in the United States, people are campaigning to get rid of certain names on buildings and schools and statues and stuff. I think one of the most absurd one I think I saw was a school that wanted to get rid of the name Lincoln somewhere.
Yes.
It's almost like they're trying to cancel Lincoln. So how important is it to not try and cancel people from the past or hold them to today's standards? It just seems a bit ridiculous to me.
Yes. Well, look, that's another issue. And I do think it's radically ahistoric to judge people from the past by our standards, as you put it. But I'm a historian and I have another, let's just say, special bailiwick here. My real fear is that we'll actually lose history. That is, if we start eliminating these names, people will know less about them. Now, look, some people, like, say, leaders of the Ku Klux Klan, they did things that are so heinous that I think it's quite justified, say, for a school to rename itself if it's named after somebody that was in the Klan. And all of these questions are difficult. I don't want to try to simplify them. But as a historian, I'm deeply concerned about the airbrushing of history, especially by people who want us to reckon with race and racism. It seems to me there's an enormous tension and contradiction there. So, one of the monuments that came down to New Orleans was a monument. I don't want to go too deep into the weeds, but basically it was a monument to white people that staged a pogrom, basically a riot, during the brief moment of Reconstruction when the federal government was trying to enforce Black civil rights and voting rights in the South. We're talking about in the years just after the Civil War. And this monument, by the way, which was taken down, it was put up in the 20s or the 30s, and it had a plaque on it that said, "These great heroes fought to rejuvenate white supremacy." And by the way, that's true, they did. But how is it a victory in the battle for white supremacy to take down that plaque? I would argue it's quite the opposite. That indeed, if we want to fight white supremacy, we have to retain those kinds of monuments so we know what it was and what it did. This debate, too, at least in the United States context, has been radically polarized in a hugely unhelpful way. Basically, this is the debate in the United States. You have people that say these are monuments to white supremacy and they have to come down, versus people that say, oh no, they're just monuments to Southern heritage or something like that, and they're very nice things and we have to keep them up. There are very few people in my camp which are saying these are monuments to white supremacy, and that's precisely why we need to preserve them, So we remember what it was. Now, they don't necessarily need pride of place, like standing above the city on some gigantic pedestal. But when these monuments are removed, they're often put in undisclosed locations. I'm sorry, man, like WTF, undisclosed locations. Like that's what you do in totalitarian societies. Like that's not democratic. So look, we've got a huge problem with racism in the United States in our history and in our present. I don't think any reasonable person debates that. I think the real debate is what to do about it. And I would argue that airbrushing, whitewashing, and removing this stuff is not helpful in that campaign. It will have conservative effects, even though it's brought to you by people that position themselves as radicals.
Yeah, we had something similar in the UK during the Black Lives Matter kind of protest. There was one statue in Bristol that got torn down and thrown into the water. Yeah. And there was some dispute over people trying to do the same with Winston Churchill statues, but you had crowds trying to protect it as well.
Right.
So I think that these issues are they're so blurry that it's hard to draw a line over who should be up there and who shouldn't. Right. And obviously Winston Churchill, it's maybe acceptable to acknowledge that he was racist, but also acknowledge that what he did as a leader.
And those are inconsistent, right? I mean, why can't we say both things at the same time? Churchill was, an avowed colonialist. He called Gandhi a funny little naked fakir. And by the way, like he also, defended Britain in its finest hour against the Blitz. Those two things are true. Both of them are 100% true. Why can't we say them at the same time?
Yeah. We're talking about like racism and stuff like that. One thing I always find when I'm having conversations about free speech, if I say to someone, we should have free speech and there shouldn't be any real limitations, they would say, well, what about hate speech? So I always find that's a tricky one to come back at, like to have any response to that. So should we allow hate speech? And if we should, or if we shouldn't rather, is there a line to be drawn there? Because I think that's right. The trouble with this conversation. We don't know where the line is. It has to keep moving.
Right. And it's complicated. Look, and here's what I'll say. I mean, here also, please understand, I'm talking from the United States, and there's a different constitutional tradition. You guys in the UK, you don't even have a constitution, not a written one. In the United States, hate speech is protected. Okay. There's amazing ignorance on this subject, even among students of law, by the way. I've had law students tell me, well, of course, hate speech is not protected under the Constitution. I'm like, dude, if you want to say it shouldn't be, let's have that conversation. That's totally fine. But if you want to say it isn't, that's like saying 1 and 1 is 3. Like, that's just wrong. So the real question is, should it be? And I do believe it should, and here's why. I don't want the state deciding what's hateful and what isn't, because I don't trust the state enough to make that determination in a fair and equitable way. The other thing that I know is once the state starts engaging in censorship, it's people at the bottom that will be screwed over, not people at the top. That's another theme of my book. And so, there's enormous hubris in this movement to restrict hate speech, because it imagines that there's going to be some great Solon, some great seer who will somehow be able to determine with perfect accuracy what is hateful and what is not. And when Trump was still president and my students would plead for bans on hate speech, I'd be like, so who do you want to decide what's hateful? How about Trump? I know you're into him. Do you want to empower Trump's government to decide what hate speech is? I don't. Look, there's a lot of hate out there, but there's also legitimate questions about what's hateful and what isn't. And I don't want to empower the state to make those judgments.
And so you mentioned,
and by the way, that isn't to say that, just to be very clear, I want to be really clear, right? Just because I don't think the state should fight hate speech, I'm not saying we shouldn't. Of course we should. And here's the other thing I want to emphasize. Raising your voice against hate speech is a form of free speech. And I think a hugely important and consequential one. So I'm not making a plea for passivity here. I'm not trying to deny the presence of hate speech, and I'm not saying we should just roll over and ignore it. Quite the contrary. What I'm saying is the solution to it lies with you and me and raising our voices. It does not lie with the state. I don't trust the state that much.
Well, that was another part of the book where you say that we should have free speech so that we can hold governments accountable and criticize governments and leaders. So why is that so important? Because I think someone who's maybe a bit more cynical would maybe say, well, my voice doesn't quite matter because I'm one person amongst millions. How is my voice going to be heard by our leaders, and how is that going to make a change? And another maybe anecdote I had about this topic is recently we had elections here in Scotland and the UK. And I remember standing in line outside waiting to vote, and the line was pretty big. And I kept seeing people drive up, get to the car park, get out their car, see the queue, get back in their car and drive away because they didn't want to wait in the line to vote. So that's the kind of people I may be talking about. These people are a bit cynical about their voice doesn't quite matter, or it doesn't really, their vote won't change anything.
Look, I get that. I understand where they're coming from. And I don't think they're unreasonable in their perception. In the United States, Congress's approval rating, I read, is at 8%. And that sounded high to me. Like, who's in the 8%? Like guys who work on Capitol Hill? I mean, Congress is a chicken shit outfit. It is. Even people in Congress say that. So I understand the cynicism, and to some degree it's justified because a lot of our political systems are broken. But how do you change that? It seems to me the only answer is raising your voice. And I've got proof of it. And the proof is in history, right? When I say proof, I mean, I have proof that it can happen. Not that it will, but that it can. And raising your voice is hardly a sufficient condition for changing the world, but it is a necessary one, 100%, right? So it's not sufficient, right? And your friends are right. Just because you speak up doesn't mean anything that would be different. But if you don't speak up, nothing will be different. That's the point. That's why we study history, I think.
Well, you mentioned another interesting pattern in history with censorship, where it seems that the people that are trying to do the censoring throughout history went from the right to the left, back to the right, back to the left. Like in World War II, you mentioned that people were trying to censor anyone who was speaking about Nazism. And then I think the 60s, it then went to communism, the complete opposite way. So what's maybe the main point you make in the book surrounding that?
Well, the main point is that if you start wielding that censorship hammer, now I'm going to mix metaphors, it's going to come and bite you in the rear end. I mean, that's really the story. Again, it's back to hubris, right? We've got the devil by the tail, let's pull. With no appreciation that this could be wielded against you, but of course it will be. So, the Nation magazine, which is sort of in the United States, kind of our guardian in a way, sort of like one of our leading left-wing journals for the past 100 years. As you mentioned, during the Second World War, it supported efforts by the Roosevelt administration to censor fascists. And we had fascists in the United States, just like you did in the UK. And they were jailed and their publications were censored and all that. But just 10 years later, you have the Nation magazine getting removed from public libraries all over the United States. Why? Because it was communist. So that's hubris right there, right? Let's support censorship because there's a bad guy out there. But let's get not think about the fact that this thing is going to be used against us. And to continue that metaphor, eventually a lot of it's going to look like a nail. All right. Once you start seeing it, you say bad guys, bad guys, bad guys. You're going to find bad guys. You are, and it will be against you. That is the story of history, and that's why it's so scary. Because the other point that I try to make in the book is that it has its own logic. Like I get the will. Makes sense. And Oliver Wendell Holmes, one of his most famous dissents, made this point too, that I quote in the book. He said, let's concede that censorship is, he called it, perfectly logical. If you see something that you think is truly horrible, like it makes sense to try to get rid of it. Like who wouldn't want to? But see, that's why we have to resist it. because I do think it's natural. I understand the impulse. I felt it myself, right? But you don't have to be Freud, I hope, to maintain that just because you have an impulse doesn't mean it's good or that you should indulge it, right? So just because the will to censor is natural doesn't mean we should do it. It means we should be aware of it and we should resist it because it's so natural, because it's so enticing. Yeah.
Yeah. I also found this interesting. I was watching Bill Maher last night, and he made an interesting point about between Democrats and Republicans in America, that Democrats used to be the party of like drug use and sex and freedom and stuff like that. And he's basically said that now it's tipped the other way and went back to front. Now you're seeing the Democrats are the kind of was the way he put it, the kind of uptight ones, and the Republicans are the ones involved in sex scandals, drug scandals, and stuff like that. I just found that so interesting, because before you had Richard Nixon with the war on drugs, and you had all these other Republicans who were trying to stop the Beatles or any like sex revolutions and stuff like that. I just found that very interesting.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, Moore likes to talk about sex, and I understand why. I mean, I think in some ways, the left won those culture wars. We don't really argue about sex like we used to, and decreasingly about drugs, right? I mean, weed is illegal in many parts of the United States. What we argue about is race and nation. I wrote a book, believe it or not, 20 years ago. That's how old I am, called Who's America? Culture Wars in Public Schools. And the reason I have it on my desk is I'm revising it for a 20th anniversary edition. That's how old the book is and how old I am. And the revision is going to be complicated. It is complicated because what I argued was that 20 years ago, the religion wars, like over sex ed, prayer in schools, gay rights, that those were the really insoluble ones. And the history wars, we could solve them by adding another group. It's just like, the Armenian Americans, they're in the textbook now. The Kazakh Americans, they're in there. It's a big happy family. And I think things have inverted now, and that's what I'm arguing in the revision. I think the religion wars, or let's just call them the religion-inflected ones, in the United States have very much cooled. There are many reasons for that, including the fact that in some ways we're becoming more like Western Europe. We're becoming more secular. There's been a radical decline in American church, synagogue, mosque attendance. But here's the problem, Gregor. We've substituted politics for religion. It's not a good thing. So our religious identities and the meaning that we make of them have attenuated, but our political identities have become much more stronger. In some ways, have become quasi-religious ones. And, that's why these wars are so brutal now. So it's not over sex ed and drugs. That's kind of, and even gay rights. I mean, in the United States, the only demographic that's against marriage equality are white Republicans over 60. Like Republicans who are young, they're like, huh? Like, do I give a shit about that? No. I mean, that ship has sailed. But the stuff we're talking about now, cancel culture, the 1619 Project, that they care about, because that's where the war is now. It's not about religion, it's about the nation.
Yeah, I think it's also important to acknowledge with these issues that I don't think a lot of people do, is how much progress has been made in the last 50, 60, 70 years with regards to these issues. It's like what you were saying before, doing two things at once, acknowledging that there's still work to do, but also acknowledge like how much progress has been made with regards to racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia now as well. Right. I think that's important to do both.
I agree. And that's actually the nub of the debate about the 1619 Project, I think. Obviously there are conservatives that just think it's America hating or all this. And, I think that's pretty easy to dismiss. There are liberal critics of it as well, however, and I think those are harder to dismiss because what the liberal critics say is that some of these initiatives actually neglect or negate the kind of progress you're describing, exaggerate the degree of oppression and diminish the degree of freedom. So was slavery an American institution? Was it absolutely integral to the creation of the United States? It was. You know what? So was anti-slavery. Anti-slavery was also largely an American product. I mean, you guys had something to do with it too, but I think it's fair to say that, the international leaders were, Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, and so on. They're Americans, and they were speaking in an American idiom, in an American tongue. They are part of the story too. And I think that, the great dilemma in history is how you balance these things, right? How you take both of them into account. And I do think there's a legitimate fear that some of our initiatives right now aren't doing that. If you teach people that America is inherently a racist place and that our laws were created to promote and encode racism, and that that's been a consistent through line, I think that you neglect what you were calling progress. And I go even further, I think that you become a propagandist, which in an ironic mirror of the, love it or leave it flag wavers, who don't want who have a singular story as well and don't want any questioning of it. The good stuff, I think, is in the questioning. And by the way, that's another reason we have to protect free speech, right? So we can have that questioning, so we can have that debate.
Yeah. How important, bringing it back up to date, is Facebook with regards to free speech? Because they banned Trump, banned Twitter, they banned him from Twitter as well.
Yes.
It seems they've got a sort of power over who can speak and who can't. Although they're a private company, the amount of people that are on these apps are like countries, more like the whole world. So they have some form of power over this.
And look, it's a huge problem, and, I think, and I quote somebody from the American Civil Liberties Union in my book saying this, like, we have to acknowledge that these are, as you were saying, they are mediums of enormous public discourse. It's true they're privately owned, right? But we can't elide the fact that there's an enormous amount of discourse and ultimately policy that's made via them. So they're public venues, right? They really are, right? It's true they're privately owned, but they're public venues and arguably the most important ones, right? For the exchange of ideas. Now, is there awful vitriol and hate and lies in them? Yes, tons and tons of it. Again, no reasonable person is going to deny that. The only real question is what to do about it. And again, I'm extremely uncomfortable with the idea of letting the state decide all of that, of having some bureau of the state that's going to regulate it. What if that bureau was directed by Trump? I mean, my students that wanted Trump off Twitter, often they want some sort of bureau. And I'm like, dude, if Trump's in charge of that bureau, he's going to stay on Twitter. And so again, I think that Jack Dorsey, I think, initially had the right idea. And I think that Dorsey has been appropriately ambivalent about this subject. That is, he's made several comments like, I didn't get into this business to police people's speech. He does not want to do that. And, I think they essentially had the right idea, which is when we see something that's false or hateful, what we say is, this is false and hateful, which again is a form of speech. That is speech when I just described. And I think at the end of the day, that's always the best remedy. Always, raise your voice, keep raising it, raise it louder and more accurately and more persuasively than the bad guys.
Well, that's the old idiom, fight bad speech with better speech.
Yes, and I believe that because I think the other alternatives are worse. None of these things are easy. And again, I understand the will to regulate and the will to censor. But I think the solution you just described is the best of the bad ones. It's not simple. It's not easy. It's not airtight. It's like what Churchill said about democracy, right? It's the worst system except for all the other ones, right? I think this is the same.
Yeah, I think with these things, I think you make this point in the book as well. When you try to shut someone down or stop them from speaking, it puts them almost in a better light. And I think that's almost what's happened with Trump. When now that he's been banned from social media, we kind of forget what he was saying every day. Like there was always a scandal. He always said something ridiculous on social media. We don't see that anymore. So people's opinion of him will maybe get a bit better because of that. Or it'll be, if they already like Trump, it will reinforce that.
and this is another pattern that I see in my book that's repeated across time. The best way to give somebody a microphone is to try to take it away. Again, I know that sounds like a contradiction, but if you look at the way this stuff is operated, that's what's happened. People gain notoriety, they gain fame by being censored. Sometimes really good people. So a great example, John Quincy Adams, who was our sixth president, son of the second president, he was arguably the most distinguished ex-president because unlike all the others, he went back to Congress and he became the leading anti-slavery voice in the Congress. And there were all kinds of efforts to censor what he was doing, including laws that the South pushed through Congress to prevent anti-slavery petitions from even coming to the floor. And that turned out to be a great propaganda boon for Quincy Adams and for his allies. Because, it makes the other team look so much worse. It's like you're so afraid and you're so doubtful of your own position that you can't handle a criticism of it. It must be weak, right? It must be weak at some level if what you're trying to do is engineer the censorship of criticism of it. Right? If you're really confident in it, if you really believe that it was right, you wouldn't bother doing all that. Like you would know it was right. You don't actually believe what you say, right? If you did, you wouldn't be trying to censor the opposite. I think that's a very powerful argument, right? And in general, I think wills to censor often do reflect a kind of ambivalence. And I think the victims of censorship have very successfully and appropriately weaponized that.
Yeah. I think, well, one of the things, moving on to a point you make about education in the book, one thing that I wasn't sure about was the idea that teachers should be able to give their opinions to their students. And the reason I'm a bit unsure about it is because I remember when I was in high school and I was quite susceptible to, say, if there's a teacher I respected and he said something or she said something, I would take that as gospel. I would take it, I respect that person, they wouldn't mislead me, and that's how it must be. And the fact that I'm 25 now, and I've genuinely only in the last maybe 2 years, I think I've just started to think for myself.
Yeah.
I would watch people I really like, and if whatever they said, well, he said it, I like him, it must be true. Whereas now I'm only just starting to learn that people I like, I don't have to agree with everything they say. There's a lot I disagree with about them. And this is I'm probably going to go on a tangent here, but this is the idea I have with Joe Rogan, for example. A lot, like if I say I really like Joe Rogan and I listen to him all the time, people will always say, well, what about this that he said and this? I'm like, well, I don't agree with everything he says, but I still love listening to him and thinking about what he says. He's great at what he does. And I think people they get so annoyed at someone if they just say one thing they disagree with, and then they just shut them off. They'll never listen to them again.
And when I agreed to go on Joe Rogan, you should have seen some of the shit I took from
I can imagine.
Because again, they trotted out some bad things he said. And it says, has he said some both, let's just say, inaccurate and offensive things? He has, But again, I don't think that's a reason not to go on Joe Rogan. Like, that doesn't make me complicit with everything he said. I mean, given how much airtime a guy has, how could you agree with everything he said? I mean, it would be weird and I think problematic if you did. Like you would be a martinet. But to get to the thrust of your question, look, this one's complicated too. And, what you're describing is the danger of indoctrination. And that's real, right? You're the adult in the room. You're evaluating these people, you're grading them. You have enormous influence over them, right? And to be clear, I think every teacher should be aware of that. And no teacher should ever be enjoined to say what they think, right? But I do think they should have the right to say what they think, depending on their professional judgment, for a number of reasons. The first one is they're political actors, right? They live in the world. I think in some ways it's quite disingenuous for teachers to pretend that they're these like Olympian figures that stand above the fray. They're not. I also think it's important for them to model a certain kind of political dialogue and political discourse with their students. So, Alexander Michaeljohn, who was an American civil libertarian in the first half of the 20th century, he actually thought teachers should say what they think all the time. I don't think so. I think it should be up to them. But his argument's really important. His famous aphorism was, slaves can't teach freedom. If what you're trying to model is a certain kind of political discourse, how can you bite your tongue, right? How can you demonstrate what politics is if you're pretending you're above it? So I do think teachers should be allowed, again, not enjoined, but allowed to give their opinion. But, and this is the huge but, when they do so, they must make it absolutely clear that it is just their opinion and the other people in the room aren't enjoined to share it. And kids get that when you're honest about it. They say, look, what I'm telling you is not the gospel, right? To use your term, right? It's my own political view because I live in the political world just like you do. I'm not going to try to disguise that, but I'm also not going to impose my political views on you, right? My job is to help you come to your own informed opinion, all right? And I think teachers should be allowed to disclose or not in the service of that, right? Depending on the situation and depending on their professional judgment, which we should respect.
Well, I think with that in mind, I think also in education, certainly in the UK, probably in the US as well, something that needs to be taught in high school and middle school and where you are is critical thinking and debate. I think so much of education before students go to university is learning through textbooks and learning through exams and assessments, and none of it is conversation and here's what I think and then debating it out. I think that's maybe also, if teachers are going to give their opinion, students should be encouraged to come back at them with something, and there should be a lively sort of debate and teach how to do that properly.
Well, of course, because it's not natural, right? You don't come out of the womb saying, I'm going to listen to what you say and consider it carefully and not kill you. I mean, if some of the evolutionary psychologists are right, it's actually the opposite. We're sort of programmed to hate on each other, right? And that's precisely why schools have to intervene in that, right? Because the kids are coming up in a media environment where they don't see this demonstrated. So sometimes Susan and I, my wife and I, will be watching on TV and they'll say, okay, after we sell you something, we're going to have a debate, about whatever, healthcare or, Israel, whatever. And then you'll just see these sort of sequential rants by people. And we'll look at each other and we'll say, was that a debate? And of course it wasn't. It was sequential rants. And I think that, you look at what's on the internet, which is really where people are getting their stuff, and it's a million sequential rants. And the really scary thing, Gregor, to think about is that we're now raising a generation that thinks that's what politics is. Politics is sequential and mutually dismissive and hostile rants. That's what they see. So the only way that changes is through school. I mean, there is no other solution, right? Of course, we should try to alter these mediums, and there have been efforts at that. But school is still the major institution that we use to create citizens, right? To socialize our young. And unless they see something else, unless they see a different model demonstrated and practiced in schools, none of this is going to change.
Yeah, I think, well, staying on the subject of education, you speak about as well pornography in that as well. So I think that's a blurry one for me as well, because I think some form of regulation is needed for pornography to prevent young people, because I think more and more young people, especially boys, are getting their sexual education from online pornography, which can have a lot of negative effects, such as some of the storylines are problematic in that women are usually the submissive, and stuff like addiction, stuff it can do to your brain, and just like the idea that that's what sex should be like. And I think boys can misinterpret that. And I think I wouldn't ever advocate that we get rid of pornography or anything like that, but at least something needs to change. I'm not quite sure what that is, but I think something needs to change with that.
I think education's the answer. I'm glad that you mentioned pornography in the context of sex education, because I think it is sex education. I think, unfortunately, most of it is really bad sex education. I think it sends, extremely destructive and sometimes misogynist messages about what sex is and can be. And I'll be very honest with you, I'm really glad internet porn didn't exist when I was coming up, because I think I would have watched it all the time. I mean, when I was 16 years old, I had different life goals, but I would say like seeing naked women was definitely near the top, And of course, we had Playboy and Penthouse and things that were stored under people's beds at homes, but that was small potatoes, right? And I'm really glad it didn't exist. I think I would have watched it all the time, and I think it would have fucked me up. But what do we do about it? If the last thing I think we want, again, is some government agency deciding what's like too awful to be on the internet. Now, just to be clear, obviously anything involving underage people should be regulated and must be illegal and is illegal everywhere. That's a whole other subject. But now I'm talking about consenting adults, right? Let's remember that since you're talking from the UK, in the United States, you couldn't get a real copy of Lady Chatterley's Lover until about 1959. So that's a story I relate in the book. Like, I come home from school holding Lady Chatterley's Lover, and my dad just laughs, and he's like, when I was a kid, I had to get a samizdat. I had to get an underground copy of that, like this one that was like circulated, sort of like Playboy and Penthouse, right? This is a real danger. Once you start to swing that axe, what's going to be cut? The argument for removing Lady Chatterley's Lover was exactly the same as the argument for removing internet porn. It was that this is going to mess up young people's minds. And again, that's not something I want the state to do. What I do want the state to do via its public schools is present a different way of thinking about sex. And I think there's some schools that have started to do that. Internet porn is with us, right? You can bemoan that, as I do, right? But you cannot deny that, okay? The only interesting question is what to do about it. And again, back to, the bromide that you mentioned about the answer to bad speech being better speech. I think the answer to bad sex ed, which is what porn is better sex ed, And some of the private schools or independent schools in the United States are doing that. And I think to very, very good effect. Describing what's happening in these films the kids have already seen, and just say, okay, what's up with that? Like, why are these people doing that? And why are so many people watching? And what are they learning? Right? That's sex ed, what I just described, and that's what we need.
And also, being a professor of is education
yes,
history.
And history. Yeah.
Obviously, teaching people is very important to you. Do you think academics should be required to take some form of teaching course? I think in the UK, especially,
we do.
I've tended to find that my lecturers, they seem to, some, don't want to generalize, some are more interested in their own research, and the lecturing the side gig that they have to do to be able to do their own research and be paid for it. So they're not very good teachers, or they're not very good at simplifying complex ideas, which is what they should be able to do.
Yes. The answer to your question is yes. It was the focus of my prior book, which is called The Amateur Hour. It's a history of college teaching. Again, apologies, very America-centric. Although my sex ed book was a global book, just saying. And I did go to the UK to do research on it. But unfortunately, most of my work has been about America. And this one was too. And the reason it's called the amateur hour is that in the United States, at the university level, teaching remains an amateur endeavor. Now, that doesn't mean it's all bad, because there's some terrific teaching. To call somebody an amateur doesn't mean they're bad at what they do. The best gymnast of my youth was Nadia Comaneci, and she was an amateur, because back then you couldn't be paid if you were in the Olympics. So it's not that it's bad, it's that we don't have like a shared set of standards about what's good about it. And most of all, to your point, we don't have institutional mechanisms to promote that and to oversee it. I know in the UK, there is a course you have to take when you become an academic, or at least there was, about teaching. Is that still the case?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I'm not quite
Yeah.
sure.
I don't know if it's required. I had a
Mm.
friend who taught at Christ Church who actually taught the class. And I
Right.
went once when I visited, and it was terrific. I mean, it was just, okay, now, how do you simplify a concept in ways that an 18-year-old will both, understand and appreciate?
Mm.
And we don't, in the United States, even have the beginnings of professional discourse about that. Like, everyone's flying by the seat of their pants. Um, and again, to mix metaphors with apologies, that's not a good way to run a railroad. You're not going to get a consistent set of outcomes if it's catch as catch can. If you just go to it. You've sat in classrooms a lot your whole life. You kind of know what it is. You've seen it. So go to it. And
Yeah.
that's what we do in the United States for the most part. There are some efforts to change that, which are laudable. I think they're still in their infancy, and it's complicated. And I don't want to go deep into the weeds like my book does, but I would say that one of the big inhibitors, since you mentioned I'm a professor of education, is that in the United States, and I think in most other democracies, the education school is the poor cousin at the university. It has less status and less money. So whenever you suggest improving college teaching, that conjures the school of education. And people are like, well, I don't want to be associated with that. That's going to reduce my status. And in fact, I have a PhD in history, but when I decreed that I was going to study the history of education, there were many of my mentors who said, like, that's a really bad idea. Because if you attach the word education to your name, you automatically subtract 100 status points. Fortunately, my main mentor, his view appropriately was, if this was important to you, this is what you should do. And he turned out to be right. But the critics weren't wrong, right? I mean, there are real issues there about status and about power. And, unfortunately, any effort to improve teaching conjures the low status of the education school. And that's actually been an interesting and longstanding inhibitor on the improvement of college teaching, alas.
So I've just got a couple more questions for you. So one I thought of that brings free speech into the context of the world we're living in now is COVID-19 and the spread of misinformation. So what do you think should happen with that with regards to speech? Because some would argue that that's putting people at risk if you're spreading misinformation or saying that COVID is a hoax or something like that. People aren't going to wear masks, then they're going to get close to other people, maybe pass it on to someone.
Look, this is a huge problem, but let's remember a couple things. First of all, there have been anti-vax movements since Jenner, right? It's true that, like with all bad speech, the internet gives that movement a bigger microphone. But if you start to try to enlist the state in regulating anti-vax statements, suddenly you're in the same realm as hate speech. What's an anti-vax statement? Okay, what if somebody says, look, I think this should be up to the individual? Is that an anti-vax statement? Somebody might think so. You could make a case for it, right? If you empower all the individuals to decide for themselves, you're going to have less vaccine than if you require people either via the employer or the state. So look, I'm not trying to deny the problem. And the anti-vax movement is real and poisonous. By the way, the UK didn't help by publishing that article in Lancet many years ago about, vaccines causing autism, in which, by the way, the author actually invented cases. Everyone should know that. It isn't just that it used bad mathematical modeling, right? He actually made up cases. I mean, that's how bad it was. So there's an enormous amount of lying about vaccines on the internet. But I still don't want the state to be censoring them, because then the state gets to decide what an anti-vax statement is, or even a statement about controlling COVID. What if somebody says, hey, how come the local florist is still closed, but Walmart gets to sell flowers? That's a reasonable question. But somebody up there in the Department of Truth might reasonably say, well, wait a second, this is kind of challenging our view on masks. and our rules on masks, we can't have this, then fewer people will mask up and more people will die. Get rid of it. I don't want that happen.
Yeah. And so my last question is just a question for me, really. What was it like going on Joe Rogan? What was that experience like?
It was a YOLO experience, I'll tell you. I mean, first of all, and an out-of-body one. I'll be completely honest with you. I still have no idea why he wanted to talk to me. Obviously he had heard about my free speech book. He had not read it. You very kindly actually read the book, clearly.
I did. Well, one of the things, I'll maybe just say that, one of the things I was pleasantly surprised about, when I usually get a guest on, I'll order the book and I'll read as much of it as I can. I'm not a very fast reader, so I usually get maybe halfway through if I'm lucky, but it arrived, I was like, oh, I'm going to get through this. It's going to be fine.
And he did it, his staff did. And obviously he's broadly interested in the question. But if you watch the interview, I mean, we don't talk that much about free speech. That's clearly what drew him to me. But, I'll be very honest with you. I had not listened to Joe Rogan before he asked me to go on. And Joe Rogan's target audience is you. It's not me, right? It's like white guys in their 20s. So after I got the invite, I just called the 20-something male sons of my friends. Right. And just said, okay, what do I need to know? Like, what's going on here? And, where do I fit? Because if you look at who else is on Rogan, it's like, a guy who drove a dog sled across Alaska, or, bungee jumped on ecstasy, or whatever it is. And I'm just like this skinny Jewish college professor. Like, what am I even doing there? And I still don't know the answer. It was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed talking to him. I had heard a lot of negative things about him because that's what the internet is. It's negative things. But I thought he was extremely cordial and friendly. And the thing I really liked about him is he didn't put on airs. Joe Rogan is an autodidact. He doesn't have a lot of formal education, right? And autodidacts often know a great deal about certain things that they've dug into. But then there are very big gaps just because they didn't have formal education. I'll admit that I was somewhat surprised that when I started talking about the caste system in Nepal, where I served in the Peace Corps, and the idea of untouchability, that Rogan seemingly had never heard of that. Like that there still is a caste system. And by the way, the listeners in Nepal, which was an incredible freak out as well, that people in Nepal listen to Joe Rogan, they were all over this. And there was like a subreddit of Nepalis that listened to Joe Rogan, and that were, I speak Nepali a little bit in the show. They're like parsing my accent. The whole thing was just wild. Joe Rogan seems like the most American thing on earth to me. Even the idea that there were Nepalis listening to it was incredible, but that they actually have chat groups where they discuss it. So it was an amazing experience. It was a whole world that I wasn't familiar with. But I'm glad that I did it because I learned more about that world, and I gained more appreciation for what he does than I had because I was ignorant about it.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things I said when I posted onto my social media that I was going to have you on. And so thank you very much for coming on. I said that in the post. I said it's crazy to think that this guy was on Joe Rogan and now he's coming onto my tiny little podcast. So I really appreciate the time you've given me and spending your morning having this conversation.
I'm on the most important podcasts, right? I mean, Joe Rogan and yours, right?
Yeah. I'll quote that. Maybe put that in my slogan there.
Very good. Yeah. Anyway, thanks a lot. It was fun.